Thank you. Love your necklace. Very nice.
Yours is pretty too.
Simple. Jingles. Yeah.
You ate dinner. I think it is. That was important. Like, okay,
So I'm trying to figure out what that good day means.
I think it's image of God, probably.
Image of God. You're right. Yeah, it's a good day. Yeah. Image of God.
Is that right?
Mhm.
So you're talking, when you live with a minister for as long as I have, it just kind of comes.
See? You know all that
In
stuff.
Latin slang, it means the light of the day.
Light of the day.
It's almost 7 o'clock already.
And in some churches, it can be translated as, oh, so you think you know that, huh?
Watch it that way, so it's only half of your weight really is going on the set.
Okay, now what about when you're riding? No, what about when you're riding?
When you're riding, you can just stay on.
Oh yeah, Christmas time.
Yeah. Well, you, yeah, this much here, well, much here. Yeah, and I read those exercises, and those kind of things, so I'm all set for that. Hey, dude. It's very tough to go off the top.
I'm sure. Oh God, so it's a. Yeah. Somebody she knew from high school. But she really wants to work for it. It's not more competition. Yeah. They normally do a wedding, a big and all that before the season. Or you could also put a tent in the yard, on the lake side. Have you done that? No, but I've often thought we have perfect space for tents. No, the arbor stands.
Appropriate, seasonally
They were
appropriate.
cheap until they became man of the year or whatever. Well, Zach's grandmother has a place, a house right on Long Island.
Microphone testing? Yeah, testing.
Okay, let's open with a brief word of prayer, shall we? God, we thank you for sending your Spirit to be in this group this evening. Help us to open your word that we might hear and obey what you tell us there and learn how to be kinder and more respectful of each other. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, I've got about 15 decks of the slides I'm going to show you, and I compiled this deck for those who are interested in doing further study. So I'm going to reference several books and resources, and so if you're interested, take one. If you have no intention of going further into this, I don't think you're going to need this, okay? Or you can bring it to somebody who's not here as well. That might be helpful for somebody who's not here. And the second thing is we're live streaming this. This is an experiment. We don't know how well this is going to work because I'm hoping that this will be a very dialogical, conversational presentation between all of us. So that's hard to capture on a screen, but we're going to give it a try. And so what that means is if you want to ask me a question, please raise your hand, and we have a handheld microphone that we can put in your face so that you can be heard by the people who are streaming. So as I said yesterday in my sermon, here Joe and Katie and Bev and Lisa and I have been kind of shocked by Larry Nasser and Harvey Weinstein. You know, I don't know what we were thinking. I just thought that some of the things they were doing were illegal. Is it illegal to trade jobs for sex? We have a word for that, don't we? It's called soliciting. And when I go to the doctor, if I have a female doctor, there's always a third person in the room with me, I thought. Right? Isn't that a law, or at least an expectation, that when you go to a different gendered doctor, there will be somebody else in the room just making sure everything's kosher? I guess not. I guess I was wrong about that. I guess my say that again, Brad?
Well, I think for minors, definitely.
For minors. That's all Larry Nasser worked with, is minors. Go ahead, Laura, what? Yes, that's true. Laura said that the moms were in the room with their daughters when Larry Nasser was committing his shenanigans. So there's something wrong to Joe and Katie and me. It feels like something's theologically awry. There's something socially awry, morally awry, culturally awry. But Joe and Katie and I approach these affairs from a theological perspective, so that's what I'm going to look at with you tonight. So here's a headline that appeared in one of our suburban newspapers 6 weeks ago. St. Charles man shoots his wife because she got out of line. The unspoken, unthought assumption behind that tells us that there's something theologically and socially awry with our society. So we haven't even had a word to talk about what we're going to be talking about tonight until about 40 years ago, in 1975. A group of Cornell University employees and students got together to support a woman who was being touched at work, and she resigned and sued, and they rallied around her and came up with this term called sexual harassment. And then this woman, Catherine McKinnon, gave it a real boost forward into the future in 1979 when she wrote probably the most epochal book about these things we're talking about tonight, called Sexual Harassment of Working Women. So this is about 40 years ago, right? Did you see the article in the Times this morning about Antioch College? If you haven't, you need to go see it. It's really moving. So you have to be my age, or maybe a little younger, maybe a little older to remember this, but you remember what happened 25 years ago in Antioch College? At Antioch College in 1993, there was a rape, and some of the women, this is a very radical college, right? Some of the women got together and decided to make an Antioch sexual consent policy. And so they decided that if you're going to have intimate contact with another person, you have to ask permission first. Can I kiss you? And then if you're going to go to if you're going to escalate, you got to ask again. Escalate again, you're going to have to ask again. We thought this was hilarious. We thought this was a joke. Does anybody remember this? Am I the only one? So there's a story in the Times today, a video and an article about the women who came up with this policy. So they're 40 years old today. And they were talking about how crushed they were, how hurt they were to be parodied by Saturday Night Live and lambasted by the New York Times, which claimed that Antioch was going to kill romance and passion. The women responded to the Times, "We have nothing against romance and passion, but we don't like rape. This is our ability, this is our attempt to try to stop men forcing women to have sex." So this is a consent form from 2004. All sexual interactions at Antioch College must be consensual. Consent means verbally asking. None of this. You need to ask with words. Verbally asking or denying consent for all levels of sexual behavior. We thought this was ridiculous. We thought it would be the death of romance and love. They were 25 years too soon. So this all got started on October 15, 2017, when the actress Alyssa Milano, on a whim, went onto Twitter with this ancient meme from several years before called Me Too. Tarana Burke is the woman who actually came up with the phrase, and Alyssa Milano made it famous. So she put it on Twitter and went to bed. The next morning, there were 32,000 responses. So I don't have to prove my point to you. I'm preaching to the choir. But it just goes to the point that there's something desperately awry with our world. 32,000 women. Presumably, maybe there were a few men too. Whatever the case, we're not treating each other very well. So in December, Times Person of the Year was the Silence Breakers rather. So this is Taylor Swift. This is Ashley Judd. This is the woman who took down the CEO and the culture at Uber. This is a strawberry picker from California who's harassed by her field boss. And one thing Time magazine wants you to notice is that there are 6 women in this picture. This is a woman who wants to be hidden and anonymous because she wants to keep her job. She's a hospital worker in Ohio. And Time says that these women unleashed one of the highest velocity culture shifts since the 1960s and asked how different the civil rights movement might have been if Rosa Parks had had a Twitter feed. Isn't that fascinating? Social media has accelerated these kinds of things. Ronan Farrow pointed this out to me in a New Yorker article in October. These are Harvey Weinstein's movies. Great, great films. Often small films, but great films. Intellectual films, creative films. Mr. Farrow says that Harvey Weinstein's movies have 300 Oscar nominations. I was shocked by that figure. And he goes on to say that Harvey Weinstein is thanked more at the Academy Awards more than anybody except Steven Spielberg and God. But I repeat myself. USA Today reported that 85 women have accused Harvey Weinstein of harassment. This is just 16 of them. USA Today also reported that 100 high-profile men have been accused of harassment since Weinstein. More than 260 women have accused Larry and Nasser of sexual abuse. Larry Nasser is the U.S. Women's Olympic gymnastics team doctor and also a doctor at the Michigan State University who treated many female athletes, especially gymnasts, also softball players. I deliberately didn't get any slides up here of Harvey and Larry because they make me sick. Got a few slides of their victims. It's his company. If you don't like it, leave. This was a common response from the HR department at the Weinstein Company. When Myra Sorvino, Oscar winner, right, complained to a Weinstein Company employee about a horrifying, blatantly harassing episode with Mr. Weinstein, the employee she shared this with was horrified at Ms. Sorvino that she had the audacity to bring this issue up. So these are some of the Harvey and Larry, I don't admire. They're just loathsome. But these are men that I have admired who are taken down by this whole thing. This isn't an exhaustive list. This is just the people I have admired. It's Mario Batali in the corner there. It's Kathy's hero, great chef. Not anymore. If you want to read just one article about this stuff, the Ronan Farrow New Yorker articles are great. The Times, the original bust out of all this was in the Times. Now I can't think of the two women who reported it. One is Jodi Kantor, I think. That's a great article. The New Yorker article is great by Ronan Farrow. And this one is in ESPN Outside the Lines by Barr and Murphy. They wanted to report about how Larry could have possibly gotten this away with this for about 30 years. And their contention is that there was a whole culture protecting him from exposure. So this is John Gedart. John is coach of the U.S. Women's Olympic team, worked with Larry Nasser for 25 years. Larry and John had this bad cop, good cop thing going. John was rough and inflexible and just loud with the girls, and so the girls would go scurrying to Larry for protection. They said that Larry Nasser was nerdy, and but sort of in a nice way, and sort of like a Labrador retriever puppy kind of a way. He was harmless, they thought. And it's just inconceivable to most of us that John Gedart didn't know what was going on for a while. This is Kathy Klages, the Michigan State women's gymnastics coach. 3 women came to her in 1997, in 1997, 1998, and 1999 to complain about Larry. And she told them, "You must be mistaken. I know this man and trust him." 20 years ago. And this is the disgraced former dean at Michigan State, William Strample, who was arrested for harassment himself and stood and blocked for Larry for 20 years. Now, you know my Big Ten allegiances, and I don't want to pick on a great, great university, but what puzzles me and what angers me is that this happened 7 years after Penn State went crashing down. You know, you can forgive Graham Spanier, right, and Joe Paterno, maybe, because we had no experience in dealing with this. But that just happened. The president of Michigan State watched that blow up in front of her face, and she did it again. Last night I watched, has anybody watched the new HBO show called Paterno? Al Pacino plays Joe Pa. Did you? It's very, very revelatory. Yeah, well, I guess I watched it on the first day. Huh?
Bill, isn't it true, though, that there was a culture around what happened at Penn State, no less than there was a culture around what happened at Michigan State?
Absolutely. I think that's true. In the Paterno, the HBO Paterno show, John Peepgrass says, wasn't there a culture at Penn State that kind of grew up around these revered men and kept them from exposure? And I think John's exactly right by that. But my frustration is that Michigan State watched this and did it again in the same decade. That's what I can't get. Yeah, let's try it.
Thanks, Kathy. So I just found it so disturbing that I read a lot of articles about this, and that how almost the guidelines for these gymnasts were written to just keep having them circle back to Larry Nasser. For example, there was something written, if you have a problem in the middle of the night, do not call your coach, do not call your parents, call one of these 3 people. And the 3 people listed there, were maybe those 2 and Larry Nasser. It's just, I don't understand how they let this happen. But I do understand that those girls, there were 5 spots on those Olympic teams, and those girls just, wanted that so badly. And they didn't know any other way. They didn't know what was right and wrong. And they're just these people were so sick and demented to allow this to happen to these girls.
Yeah, thank you, Katie.
Sure.
Did you hear that? That's a good observation. One thing that occurred to me as I was reading this stuff is that institutions are like organisms. It's very Darwinian. It's survival of the fittest. And those with the sharpest claws and the fiercest teeth survive, like the Weinstein Company for a long time, like Penn State University, like Michigan State. And the problem is that the HR departments in these institutions work for the boss. They work for the man. They work for the board, the corporate board or the Michigan State board. And so if you go with a complaint, you've already put yourself in jeopardy. You've already exposed yourself. So I think that's a good point. So here's just one story, maybe the worst story. So Kyle Stevens in the trial for Larry in East Lansing. Is it Lansing or East Lansing? East Lansing. A couple weeks ago, she was the first woman to testify against Larry. He began to penetrate her digitally when she was 6. 6-year-old has no apparatus to process what's going on. So at 12, she shared a story with a friend who'd also described something similar and decided that this had not been right. At 13, her parents asked her to apologize to Dr. Nasser. At 18, just before she left for college, she told her father one last time, "I was not lying 5 years ago when I told you what he did to me." And he pinned her by the neck against the chair she was sitting in and said, "What did you say?" And then her father looked at her in the eye and noticed that this woman has nothing to gain by persisting in this story, and his face just collapsed. He actually committed suicide a while ago, many years after this event. So that was the hardest story that I had to process. Imagine you're one of the mothers who delivered your daughter to Larry Nasser's house after hours in the evening and waited in a line for 2 hours while he was examining your daughter. It could have happened to any of us. I'm not being critical of these parents, except I wish they had believed their daughter. So that's the problem. Let's look at a theological solution to our problem. There are 2 creation stories in Genesis. You probably have noticed this. The first one starts with the first verse of the Bible, and the second one picks up a little way into chapter 2. The first story that we're looking at tonight is actually the later, younger, earlier story. The second one, which Joe will talk to you about next week, comes first and is more aboriginal, more naive material. This is actually fairly sophisticated theology in Genesis 1. It was probably written from the period of Babylonian captivity, which means 6th century BC. I'm not going to get into how we know that tonight, but it's a pretty solid scholarly finding. The author of the first creation story is often called a priestly writer because in other portions of the Pentateuch, we think were written by him. He's fascinated by and jealous for the Jerusalem temple. For instance, how does the first creation story conclude? In Genesis 1. Yes, the Sabbath, a ritual observance, the central festival in Jewish faith. So that's one reason we think he's a priest. He's at least interested in ritual and sacrament and holy buildings. Oh, she said he rested, and I said Sabbath. Jennifer said he rested, and I said Sabbath. So we'll notice that it's a very left-brain linear account of creation. It almost sounds as if the author is an engineer or a scientist, kind of writing how a master technician might assemble a cosmos. Doesn't it feel that way to you? What's the first thing that happens on day 1 in creation? In the first story. Yes. In the beginning, God said, let there be light, and there was light, right? Oh, by the way, God's primary work in creation in this account is to separate amalgamated elements, like light and dark, to Louvie's point, water and earth, sky and sea, male and female. So day one is light. What happens on day two? Anybody know? There's no reason you should know this, but day two, God separates the waters above from the waters beneath, sky and land. See, this is all just primordial goo before God gets to it. And God's separating the stuff out so that we have a place to stand and also water to drink and to sail across. Day three, the sea, the land, and plants. Day four, the sun and the moon. The sun to rule by day and the moon by night. Day five, birds and fish. And day six, the land animals and people. And then the account goes like this. Look at the second paragraph. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. And this is the crucial verse that I want to think about with you tonight. So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, God created them. Isn't that an interesting way of thinking about it? So the word, this is the New Revised Standard Version, talks about the likeness of God. We're talking about the imago Dei, which is Latin for the image of God. So what does that mean? Give me some synonyms for the word image. What are we to God, the original? Joyce? Reflection, that's a good word. Excellent. Anybody else want to offer something? Likeness, yes. These are some that I thought of. Likeness, stamp, copy, facsimile, yes. But how are we the likeness or the facsimile of God? What do we share with God?
Qualities.
We'll say that again, John?
Qualities.
We share qualities. Which ones?
Qualities of love, qualities of compassion, qualities of honesty, integrity.
Okay, you're getting at a lot of what I wanted to hear. John says we share qualities with God. When I asked him what qualities, he said qualities of love, honesty, integrity.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so Louvie, yeah.
I'm just curious, why then when we share hate and anger and murder and all the other horrible stuff?
Did you hear what Max says? The way the scriptures might tell that story is that whatever's beneficial about us comes from God, and whatever is not so laudable about us, that we did to ourselves, or in some theologies, that comes from the Satan.
That's not what that phrase said.
Well, it leaves that out. You have to read further to get the rest of it.
Why did they say we? Why did they use the plural in God speaking as we need to do this?
It's a good question. Our conservative friends see that as a primordial aboriginal reference to the Trinity, that is Father, Son, and Holy Ghost speaking. More progressive Christians think of that in terms of the royal we. When a king speaks, he will say, let us destroy France, or whatever. Yes, Jennifer.
I always heard it was because it was translated from Hebrew, Elohim, and Elohim in Hebrew is considered plural, and they were more monolatrous in those days and tended to believe there were many gods, but just the one that was talking to them was ours. But in any case, I wanted to say, what about the image of God? Later in Genesis, the thing that God says has made them like him is when they get the knowledge of good and evil.
So when they did exactly what God didn't want them to do, they became more godlike?
Yes.
Okay, that's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about that. I thought that's possible. And that's why God was a little threatened, a little jealous. Jennifer says that the we, the pronoun, the plural pronoun, first person, in this passage has something to do with the fact that the word for one of the words for God in the Pentateuch is Elohim, which is actually Hebrew for gods. But what I think is going on there is that is a plural of maximization. That is to say, our God is so great, saying a God is not enough. We have to say all gods. Our God is all gods. That's what that plural has to do with. But here are some of the, I think John's onto it when he says we share qualities with God. Here are some of the things that have been identified as the things that make us most like God. Our brains, we have way oversized brains, right? And so Weinstein and Stephen Hawking, it's there that we see the image of God most profoundly. Others have said that it's our spiritual relationship with divinity that makes us more divine-like. That's the image of God in us. Some people have said that our immortality makes us divine. That is, in some thoughts, we're the only creature that has life after death, that has a life with God after we die. So that is one aspect of our image of God. Another one is our morality, the fact that we know the difference between right and wrong. So the categorical imperative of Kant. Some have suggested our creativity makes us like God. We create works of art and buildings and clothing and everything just like God does. Some people have said that it's our sense of humor that makes us like God. Our ability to laugh. What do you think about that? Others have said it's our opposable thumbs. So maybe John's right and we take these all together and that's what makes us look like God. But what here is, we'll look at that key verse again. So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, God created them. I wonder why the author pauses to talk about our genderedness in that verse. Right next to the Imago Dei, he talks about our genderedness. So here's Karl Barth, probably the greatest Protestant, well, probably the greatest theologian of the 20th century, certainly the most prolific, 13 brick-sized volumes called Church Dogmatics, including where he talks about our sexuality. God exists in a relationship and fellowship. That is fundamentally, essentially, from the very beginning, if you can talk about beginning when you're talking about God, God exists as relationship. As the Father of the Son and the Son of the Father, God is in God's self, I and thou. God created humankind in God's own image and corresponded with God's own being and essence. Because God is not solitary in God's self, it's also not good for the human being to be alone. And so God created this genderedness so that we'd want to be together. We would realize our incompletion by ourselves.
What does that mean, God is not solitary?
This is a reference to the Trinity, to the fact that God is essentially tripartite, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. God is not monolithic. God is tripartite. Unitarians have a tough time with this part of it. So this is Cynthia Campbell on Karl Barth. Here then is Barth's doctrine of the Imago Dei, because God is essentially God in relationship. Essentially a relationship, God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So the human as image of God is essentially related. And the most basic and determinative relationship in which we find ourselves is the male and female together. This is not talking just about male-female relationships, but that is so fundamental to who we are that we realize in that essential nature that we're incomplete by ourselves and we need each other. So there's no proto-humanity in our creation myth like there is in the Greek myth, right? Do you know Plato's Symposium? Aristophanes says that originally humanity had 2 heads and 8 limbs, and they faced away from each other. And when they ran, they did cartwheels on these 8 limbs. And they go really, really fast. And they could go up to heaven. And this threatened Zeus. And so God, or Zeus, cut them in half and separated them. And that explains, according to Aristophanes, why sexual attraction is so urgent, so powerful. We're trying to get back to the lost other, to the lost half. It's a kind of a, I think it's a beautiful myth, but it's not ours. according to Genesis, back to the beginning, there's no ungendered proto-human. There never was a moment when we were ungendered. It is a fundament of humanity. We're created for relationship because we're created in the image of God, who is essentially relationality. This is not just talking about the sexual relationship between men and women, but also father-daughter, mother-son, cousin, friend, whatever. Now, this is an extravagant hypothesis, so I invite you to take it apart. John.
I'm uncomfortable with how this speaks to the matter of homosexuality. You knew that question was coming.
Yeah. Yes, excellent point. So the Dogmatics was written finished probably around 1960, 61. This is 50 years old, almost 60. So this is the slide I wanted us to see. It'd be fascinating to know how Bart, who was brilliant, would respond to this issue of experience from the LGBTQ community. It's a very good question. What other questions do you have about this? Does it make any sense, or is it just theological gobbledygook? Now, when we think about ourselves as created in the image of God, we usually think of our large brains, or our capacity to know the difference between good and evil, or our capacity to create beautiful things. But you could say that the image of God then from Genesis 1 is not so much upon us or within us as between us. That the Spirit of God is when we're relating faithfully and respectfully to each other. And so I'm grateful that that phrase, male and female, God created them, is in the Hebrew creation story, because it emphasizes our interdependence and our need for one another, our essential incompleteness on our own, and also the parity of the genders. There is nothing in the Hebrew story of the New Testament's male superiority, male headship. And that is a pleasant, conspicuous absence, I think. Now, to be fair, Hebrew culture never lived up to this equality. It was always and everywhere a lopsided patriarchy. Women do not fare well in this culture, but hypothetically, its scriptures offered up the theological resources to create a society without male superiority. And I hope Joe will reinforce this next week with the second creation story, which gets across the same realities in a different way. Questions or comments about this? Joyce, yes?
It just occurred to me for the first time. Oh, it's not that good. I say it just occurred to me for the first time how kind of miraculous it is and God-driven that we kind of, all of the people, the millions, I don't know how many billion people are we now on the planet, it's kind of evens out, men and women.
You mean in sheer numbers, or?
Yeah. I mean, we're almost always evening out. I mean, a little bit here and a little bit there, but I think that's kind of miraculous.
Okay. Other questions or comments? If these powerful bosses had thought of their targets as imago Dei, as inherently equal and on parity with them, could they have used their power to get what they wanted without considering the consequences? Karl Barth made the cover of Time magazine in the 60s. I want to tell you about one more German theologian, actually Barth was Swiss, but he taught in Germany. Martin Buber is another German theologian who taught at the University of Frankfurt am Main until 1933, when Hitler became chancellor. He resigned and became professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He was nominated 10 times for the Nobel Prize in Literature and 7 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. He hated Zionism because it wasn't an I-thou relationship. That is his most famous book from 1923, I and Thou, simplest title you could possibly think of. You don't have to read the book because the meaning is in the title. All he means is that when we are hitting on all cylinders as human beings, we relate to each other I to I to you, instead of I to it, right? Dr. Buber distinguished between I-thou relationships and I-it relationships. I-thou is an equitable relationship between human subjects. I-it relationships are between a human subject and a usually inferior object. Interestingly, Dr. Buber says that you can have an I-thou relationship with non-human entities like a beautiful tree or a sunset or a work of art that inspires you, anything that makes you come alive. And more than that, I can only be an I when you're being a you. Without you, I'm not an I. I'm just an object. I'm a thing. I'm incomplete. I'm insubstantial. I'm ethereal without you, is what he will say. So he distinguishes also between egos and persons. Egos appear by setting themselves apart from other egos. Persons appear by entering into relationship with other persons. As soon as we touch a you, we are touched by a breath of eternal life. And then this is the statement that made me think of Me Too. In sick ages, I have a feeling we might be in a sick age. In sick ages, it happens that the it world, no longer irrigated and fertilized by the living currents of the you world, severed and stagnant, becomes, he calls it a swamp thing. The creature from the Black Lagoon is what he calls it. Becomes a gigantic swamp phantom and overpowers individuals. As the individual accommodates himself to a world of objects that no longer achieve any presence for him, he succumbs to it. I think that's the kind of moment that we're in right now. For people like Harvey and Larry, their targets were not yous, they were its, right? They were not subjects but objects. They were not persons but things. Salma Hayek wrote this in the Times in December. Every time she said no, it would instigate what she calls Weinstein's Machiavellian rage. He is a very ill person. He said to her, I will kill you. Don't think I can't. I mean, can you imagine either a potential sexual partner or a potential business partner to say this to another human being? I will kill you. This is a dispute over the creative aspects of a film. Jill?
They were not so much, these victims were not so much its, but hers.
Could you repeat that, Jill? And then when you repeated it, just explain what you're saying.
They're targets of Harvey Weinstein and so forth. Were not its, as it says there, but her. They're all females, right? They're what they're notorious for. They're all female targets.
Maybe he gave them that label. He certainly didn't feel
But it, sorry. I don't think it always has to be female. I mean, if you remember the movie Devil Wears Prada or other situations. I had a personal situation where I was threatened by a female well, she wasn't even a supervisor, she was just older, and threatened that if I didn't give her her old job back, that she would tell the people in the business that I tried to rape her in the conference room. So it's not always women.
No, but I mean, it's still the two different genders come into, one
Right, exactly.
using the other.
I do, but it's a person with power over a person without. And it's that abuse that,
Yep.
And it still speaks to your point about the other and I and thou.
Yeah, the fact that Harvey, in Harvey's case, his victims were female, that's essential to the story. That's very true. Kevin Spacey's were all male. And just,
So, but Bill, there's a broader point, right? You're focusing on kind of the sexual harassment element. You know, obviously today in the news we're dealing with, you know, Assad gassing his own people, right? You can continue to roll back in time, and you know, every generation has the situation where I am treating an it as something less than me, be it, you know, genocide, or be it slavery, or be it just, you know, taking property and possessions and oppressing. You know, it's humans have kind of this constant desire to feel superior toward others, and therefore it's this, you know, if I can dehumanize you, make you an it, then I feel more comfortable taking advantage of you. You know, I think the question is what's happening in our society is the focus on more individual rights, my ability to do what I want, absent of an impact, a broader impact on society. Is that causing more of these I-it relationships as opposed to these I-thou relationships, be it sexual harassment or be it any other thing? And so what is it in our society that has changed that and is propagating that to a greater extent? Or is it just simply that with social media and with, you know, the ability to access channels of communication, we're just hearing about it more? So is it really happening more, and why? Or is it just we're hearing more about it?
Joel, I need a new battery if you've got one in there. So Scott's raising a good question. There's so many arenas of life when we treat the other and the different as an inferior. It's not just in sexuality. We just took the coincidence of Larry Nasser and Harvey Weinstein on the one hand and Black Lives Matter on the other as an excuse to talk about these things in those two primary relationships. We could keep going. Assad is a good example of somebody who treats everybody as an it. So we decided just to do 5 classes. We didn't think you'd have the attention span to do more than that. And we're going to talk about Thanks, Joel. That should work better. So we're going to talk about harassment in the workplace, abuse in the domicile, race in our cities, bullying among our children, and what else? What have I missed? We could talk about war, that is undervaluing the different nationality or ethnicity. I would love to do a session on pornography. Talk about the way in which that objectifies other human beings. Yeah, you think so, Kathy? Kathy says pornography is the epitome of objectification. Sylvie talks a lot about this. I try to get her to talk to us about what she teaches our young people about pornography, but she thought maybe that would be too sensitive, a conversation with adults. So good point, Scott. We just got to draw a circle somewhere, right? And it's a matter of our disgust over, especially Larry Nasser and Harvey Weinstein. Something let loose in this culture in October through December that we needed to talk about. But this is the comment from Selma Hayek that I thought kind of reflected a non-Buberian way of looking at the world. In his eyes, I was not an artist. I was not even a person. I was a thing. She didn't even rise to the level of a nobody. All she was a body. So Jill, to your point, this is maybe what you were trying to say. She felt like a sexual object and nothing else.
Felt like arm candy.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that Ms. Hayek's disputes with Harvey Weinstein are creative, not sexual. He hated the movie she was making.
So, Bill, I'm interested in the point that if this was a year ago and this hadn't happened, that would be sadder to me than the bravery of the women who've come forward and dealt with the issue. So is there a hopeful message in that?
Oh,
And how does that fit into you and I and thou and all that?
Well, I mean, this is a good news, bad news story, right? The bad news is, I'll show you in the next slide. Here's the bad news. There was a meta-study that involved many, many studies, but the upshot is that 86,000 women were queried and 58% of them reported experiencing harassment in the workplace. Does that sound right to you all?
Is that just physical?
I'm surprised it's not higher.
Louvie says, I'm surprised it's not higher. Brad, did you say something?
Is that full harassment? Is that mainly physical or is it emotional? Or is it
All the above. Both. Verbal, physical, and not just in the workplace. In my opinion.
Yeah, very true. I mean, you can walk down the street and get catcalled, right? But nobody ever catcalled you? That's unbelievable. Is that true, Joyce? Joyce says nobody's ever bothered her at all. So Dana, this is the bad news. 60% of graduate students in American universities report being harassed in their studies. The good news is now we know this. Now we're going to be on the lookout for it. And men don't have a free pass anymore. They don't have a get-out-of-jail card. Jim?
Simple question. Some level of harassment. Define that. I mean, I could be, if I see a woman, I say, wow, I really like your hair. It really looks great. You know, is that sexual harassment?
Great question. You led me on. Great question. You know what I should have done? There's a legal definition for harassment. I should have looked up what it is. Dana knows? Dana, can you give us a thumbnail sketch?
Well, I would say to the last question, which I think is a good one. You've got to look at. I mean, the person gets to decide who's being harassed, gets to decide whether it's harassment. And it may be that somebody else saying something similar, they wouldn't view it as harassment because of their different relationship with them. And in the workplace, there are two different kinds, basically, of sexual harassment. One is hostile work environment, which is comments, and the other tends to be quid pro quo, where sort of the Harvey Weinstein kind of deal.
It could also be so common, where it's just accepted that that's what happens in the workplace.
Yeah, a lot of people are insisting that CEOs and boards create a safe culture for the workplace, and some are toxic places, like Uber apparently was. Others are very safe. Give it to Sherry.
For years, this has been going on. And you say it started with these two. What about Bill Cosby? What about Bill Cosby? What about the fact that a hung jury found, now he's being retried, but he's been accused, and the accusers.
That's
have
very
been
true.
dismissed.
Anita Hill,
Yes,
and Clarence
exactly.
Thomas, Bill Clinton,
Certainly.
and what's her name? Monica. So this is not, this goes back to Adam and Eve, right? Of course, but something different happened with Harvey Weinstein. When Ashley Judd went public, that was epochal. That was epochal. Also, by the way, someone else, Gretchen Carlson is a member of my church in Greenwich, very faithful, pious. She's the granddaughter of a Lutheran minister from Minnesota. She was one of the Fox and Friends hosts until 3 or 4 years ago. She's a very faithful member of my church, and I wanted her to do this session, but she won't come. She's too busy. Everybody wants her to come. So Gretchen Carlson preceded Ashley Judd, but something different happened when Ashley Judd came forward.
But it doesn't seem like the behavior of men has been what's different. It's what has happened with women that is different. That the door is open to now, no more.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, no more is maybe a better word to use than me too. Time's up. Is that what it is? No more, time's up. Yeah. Time's up.
That was the big thing at the Oscars this year.
That's right, yeah. So somebody back here, Jim, I guess, asked, yes, what is harassment? Great question. Lumping it all together is a mistake. There's a difference between groping, touching somebody, and complimenting your colleague's appearance. So what about Jim's comment? Should cross-gender colleagues compliment each other's appearance?
So I think you kind of have to go back to what Dana was saying, in that it depends on how a person takes it. And if you are a chairman or a CEO or a boss of anybody, you can make a mistake, but you have to learn from that mistake. You know, I'm sure every business person here had situations that they had to deal with where someone came to them saying they felt uncomfortable. You can't say, well, you shouldn't feel uncomfortable, right? You're wrong. It's, all right, well, how do we deal with the situation? So it's not that bad things won't happen. It's that what do you do when something is brought to your attention? You can't say, well, that's your problem.
You should be talking.
That's okay. You were making some very pointed comments.
I was so listening so hard.
So I think
Yes, the power dynamic is a crucial ingredient to answering the question, is this harassment? Elaine?
You know, the evangelical right, who are, supporters of Trump, and how they are able to compartmentalize who they think he is with who he really is. And, that the behavior that he puts forth again and again in degrading men, women, and everybody, how they're able to just put that in a little box and say, well, he's doing this. And I'm not just talking about Trump, but I'm talking about, it just seems to be the culture that we've learned over the years to compartmentalize people's behavior. And there's still a good egg if they're doing this, and we're going to let that go. I remember having my own mother. I got in an argument with her about Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, and I said, this young woman was about the age of his daughter. But she was so for Bill Clinton, rah Bill Clinton, and I was so frustrated with her. But this is the way it is so much with people. They are able to ignore absolutely beastly, horrendous behavior because there's another aspect of that person that they think is okay. So they're excusing this horrid behavior. I'm just kind of at a loss.
Well, they got two Jims here. This Jim and that Jim.
Yes, I was reflecting upon what was said about a court case, hung jury and all of that. Having been on a couple of juries, there is so much of a dynamic that is separate from what we would consider a public outcry or public stance, acceptance in society. Once 12 people are in a jury room, it's so totally different. And I think we have to put that in perspective too. It's not that people liked what Bill Cosby did, but now they have to do something else. They have to go beyond liking or not liking. They have to make a decision upon the law. And that can be a big difference.
Related, and I question the ethics that have happened, but when many of us were in the corporate world, Bill Agee and Mary Cunningham came along, and that was a remarkable change in relationships. One, he shouldn't. Two, she shouldn't benefit. And the trade-off there was amazing. The corporate world stepped back and said, we have to put in training sessions so people know how to behave, or at least we're going to tell them how they should behave, and we're going to govern, we're going to manage. Never happened in politics. never happened in Hollywood. Two terrible situations. We still have people in political life who are paying off using our dollars to make accusations go away. Tax dollars shouldn't be used for that. But in politics, it's been the ultimate power base. Corporate structures all had power, but I'm elected, not beholden to a board of directors, I think was a huge, I don't know, door to politicians.
Are you
the
saying
corporates have been better at it, have not in any way become perfect at it, but the corporates had a police force over them called their boss or their directors or shareholders? Yeah.
Interesting. So, I used to.
Bill, can I ask a question again?
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Well, let's pretend that I'm 20 years old and I go to college and I find a girl that I really like a lot and she really likes me a lot. And we have a few drinks, but this goes on for 2 or 3 or 4 months. I mean, we really had become a relationship. And one night we get carried away and we have sexual relations. The next day or 2 weeks later, she says, I raped her. What defense do I have?
Well, you probably won't be convicted, right?
I don't know.
Oh, you might.
I will. The way the colleges are now trying to treat that, it's the woman that they believe, and the man basically is in, you got to be very careful if you're a 19, 20, 21-year-old guy.
That's true. So if you're at Antioch College, you got to get permission. And then that'll keep you from conviction or from suspension.
Maybe.
So I am part of a book group of 2 other ministers, and we were young back when this was happening, but we'd go out for lunch once a month or every 6 weeks. And my male colleague I really looked up to him. He was so smooth, and I'm sort of awkward and shy and everything, and he was so outgoing. But we'd be sitting there at a restaurant, and he'd take a look at the waitress and he'd say, we're harmless, we're all happily married, but you are so beautiful. And I sort of admired his ability to say that, but sort of cringed too. So is that harassment? Yes, Max, you think so? Should we stop complimenting each other then? I mean, should we not admire each other's pulchritude?
It depends how the woman felt about what you said.
Yeah.
It's her decision.
And I think harassment is
What'd you say, Bonnie?
I said women don't have any sense of humor or any of that like that. I mean, I think it's fabulous to be complimented. I love being
exactly.
So back in the 60s and the 70s, there were these 2 warring factions in feminism, right? On the one hand, there was Catherine McKinnon, sexual harassment of the working woman, who was radical feminist, don't put up with any of that crap, report the bastard. And on the other side, there was Helen Gurley Brown, sex and the single girl, sex in the workplace, saying, use your feminine wiles. Take advantage of it.
I think we all like compliments, but I think sexual harassment involves aggressiveness. That's why.
Was my friend's comment
difference.
aggressive, Lima, do you think?
No, I don't.
It's in the eyes of the beholder. It's in the eyes of the beholder. If it makes someone uncomfortable, it's
Would he have
harassment.
said that if his wife was there?
He would have, yes. Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. Yeah, he would have.
So men are like this.
He also lost his ordination by doing horizontal counseling later, but anyway.
One comment on that.
Oh, wait, Jim, here.
Just one comment. The attractive waitress, this is a terrible thing to say, gets bigger tips than the man. And, should we compliment the server because she got dolled up and looks good, you know, we pay them more. And I don't mean just we men. If you're dressed well, you get a better tip.
We're going to do 3 more minutes and then we'll quit, okay?
Thank you. Okay. I imagine most baristas, waitresses, they're working individuals just trying to get by on their own independently. You get a guy who's coming up ordering coffee from you and say, "Hey, can I get your number?" Well, I'm just trying to work here. I don't need you trying to distract me while I'm working. I did not ask for a compliment on duty.
There was a nice article in the Times a month ago or so about what especially waitresses, probably waiters too, but especially waitresses have to put up with in order to maximize tips. It's not quite fair.
Wow, thank you. I wanted to go back to the comment about corporate America and about how someone mentioned that they've done a better job than maybe the arena of politics, and I beg to differ because I was absolutely shocked that, you know, when all this stuff came out about Matt Lauer and NBC News, I mean, come on, they knew about some of this with Charlie Rose and with Fox News with Roger Ailes. You know, it's only when they had irrefutable proof and they had, you know, there were numbers of accusers that they couldn't look away. But I think they did a horrible job, and maybe now that
Who's
maybe
they,
now
Gail? Who did a horrible job?
I thought NBC, Charlie Rose, PBS, and
in
Fox
other words,
News.
they
I mean, I
protected
don't think
these
any
men
of
for
them.
too long. Is that what you mean?
Pardon?
They were too silent too long, protecting
oh,
these.
absolutely they were.
Yeah.
Absolutely
What'd you say,
they
Sherry?
were. Well, in the case of Fox News, they were paid off.
So the payoffs were a big no-no.
Well, and at Fox News, not only was it Roger Ailes, it was Bill O'Reilly, you know. So.
Louvie?
She's cute though.
I wonder how much of this are the realities of economics. To your point that a woman gets paid more, a woman actually doesn't get paid more. She makes 70 cents on the dollar to every man. And there are a few exceptions, like actresses and very high-profile women. But the vast, vast majority of women do not make as much as a man. So by giving her a bigger tip, she's just trying to figure out a way to get more money. And I wonder if by equalizing pay that somehow these questions might, these issues might go away.
Richard will be our last comment.
I came here tonight hoping to hear solutions, and I heard a few. Me Too, fantastic solution. Training, I heard, another great solution. One other solution I heard of many years ago was the no tolerance for bullying, which I think our grade schools have learned a lot about how to implement. But I was hoping that we would kind of go out of the box and start thinking about other things that we can do to solve this problem. A couple things. How do we limit aggressiveness in sports, all the way from, grade school? How do we limit aggressiveness on campus? I would like to see the elimination of fraternities and sororities as a significant step to that progress.
Well, we've got 4 more classes, and Joe's going to be talking about some of this stuff next week. I think she's going to approach it scripturally, but press us on that.
I'd like to see just more religion, more love of God, more that kind of thing in our society. It is verboten to speak about religion, to speak about faith in your God, and having definite
moral factor. I think that's really lost in our culture. One of the things on Facebook was, oh God, how did you let this happen in our school? And the answer was, well, I'm not allowed in schools. So there's, I don't like what's happening in our culture.
We can practice religion without talking about it. You can enter into these I-thou relationships and treat every other comer into your life as your peer, as the image of God.
Kathy's been amazing, by the way. I just think, just in terms of solutions, I think more women in positions of power in every, in politics, in entertainment, in schools, I think will start to help. I think it's in some of these kind of old boy networks that you've had this sort of happen. So I just think that's my solution: more women in positions of power and talking about it like this. I think this never would have gotten as big as it is if you didn't have these powerful women stepping up and saying, this happened to me.
Yeah.
I mean, if it just was sort of the lowly office assistant saying, this happened to me, the waitress, but when you had all the women we just talked about, Ashley Judd and Gwyneth Paltrow, and who's the woman who was married to Brad Pitt? Angelina Jolie. When they stepped up, I feel like this is when people said, wow, this is real. This is systemic. Great word. So that was my solution. Just more women.
There you go, Richard. There's a solution. We'll get some more next week. Thank you for coming out, guys. I appreciate it.
And Kathy did a great job.